new spot. Can you hear me? Robert was either not talking about me or he needs to get his eyes checked when he said the crowd was slim today. So we'll go with he wasn't talking about me. Devil, sin, and hell is our subject. I figured it up. Maybe 6 or 7 weeks. I know that sounds like a lot, but that's kind of the end of the quarter. So that's what we're shooting for. Romans 1 talks about the reprobate or the unapproved, not approved by God mind, and it gives these characteristics. We call them types of sins or that we've been going through. And last week we finished up with the sin of pride. And I can't even begin to think of a better example of pride than Haman, the book of Esther. I'm sure there are others. And as we go through, we've also kind of mentioned how these is overlap the right word. One leads to the other, or a person that we read about, the account that we read about, you can see where it starts with one thing and goes to the next and goes to the next, and so there are multiple. We want to call them types of sins or ways to sin. But pride, we've mentioned before, and we didn't spend a lot of time on it because we've mentioned it so much. But this sin of pride, that's at the root of a lot of this, isn't it? People think that they know more than God knows, or they think that they are better than other people, or they're filled with this self-value or self-worth that's not realistic, and it leads them to do other things. Especially the sin of pride. When we sin, we think we're better than God. We know more than God. We're higher than He is. And so we want to keep that in mind. So that's kind of where we left off with pride. We had this up on the board. I'll leave it there for just a second. You can copy some of that down. Haughty, high-minded, we would say. And we mentioned there Hezekiah. We'll mention that as well. Hezekiah, he was proud of himself. Showed the emissaries from Babylon all of his treasures. And that didn't work out too well for him because a few years later they came back and took all that stuff. So, and that was calling it stuff's not the things from the temple and the items. So we see that. So now define the sin of boaster, and I wanted to go back on pride because pride kind of leads right into boasting, doesn't it? If you're proud. We see a lot of the examples that we have in the Bible of someone that's going to brag about it. So if the sin of boasting is to brag. We'll put this up here. Aladzon is the Greek word. Means to brag, pretentious display of self-worth. Pretentious display of self-worth, to brag. Nebuchadnezzar, Daniel chapter 4, one of the things that got him into trouble was the fact that he was bragging. Look what I've built, look what I've done, look at everything that I've accomplished. When in reality, who had given him that ability or who had allowed him to be blessed like that? Well, it was God. Even though he was a king of a foreign nation, God was still in charge. But Nebuchadnezzar put it in terms of, look what I have built. That's the phrase that I took out of that. So we see Nebuchadnezzar is one that's a bragger. Goliath, 1 Samuel chapter 17, particularly there in verse 44 I picked out. He stood in front of the Israelite army for 40 days, we read, and all he did was brag. Eventually to the point he said, whoever you got, bring them on. Come to me. He was bragging, and we know what the end of that was. First of all, what happened to Nebuchadnezzar after he made all these brags? Okay. He was stricken, went out in the field and ate grass like the cattle. Okay. Goliath, he makes this brag, bring it on, come to me, send your best out. In God's eyes, David was the best. In man's eyes, David might have been, if not the least, he would have been down at the bottom of the list of who you would have sent to fight against Goliath. But what happened to Goliath when he bragged, or when he was a boaster? Okay? Stone hit him from the sling of David. He fell down dead. John said he lost his head. David cut his head off and they paraded it around, didn't they? Come to me was Goliath's boast. I've got it written up here so I can't ask the question. But in my head, when I think of someone that brags or boasts, this was told by Jesus, this account. He's relaying it. But I think of this Pharisee in the temple in Luke 18. Does everybody remember that guy? Yeah. Jesus is trying to prove a point. Tells them, don't be a bragger, don't be a boaster, don't be too proud, don't be arrogant. Says it's a Pharisee goes into the temple and he makes all these claims. And one of the things is, thankful I'm not like this sinner over here. Well, what was the sinner doing? The sinner was expressing repentance, wasn't he? With his prayer, with his words to God. But not the Pharisee. The Pharisee, he's proud, he's boasting. I'm thankful that I'm not like this sinner. And to tell you the truth, he was probably not like the sinner, was he? He was, but he wasn't repentant, was he? No, he was proud and boastful. Okay? 2 Corinthians chapter 9. 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 2. Somebody read that when you get it. Okay, so who's speaking? Well, if it's a letter to the Corinthians, it's Paul, right? And it says there, Paul boasted about the Corinthians to those in Achaia, talking about how they had collected and was ahead of the game on making that collection that they were going to send to Jerusalem. And he said, to them I boasted of you. So is all boasting sin? No. What makes this the sin, boasting? Well, go back and look at these three. Look what I've done. Come unto me, thankful I am not like this sinner. We place the emphasis on ourselves about how good we are and how much we've accomplished, even to the point that we can do it better than everybody else, and everybody should be thankful that we are who we are and we're helping. I mean, it's all about us, isn't it? What was Paul doing when he was boasting? Okay, it was about someone else. And he was happy, he was expressing appreciation for the way that they had handled their business, hadn't he? Okay. I found two words here, two big long words. I know I've got at least two English teachers in the audience, so you're not alone today, Leslie. Ostentatious. We don't use that word a lot. I hear it a few times. ostentatious. Someone who seeks attention. To me, that looks like that's what Nebuchadnezzar was doing. He was trying to draw attention to himself. Definitely what Goliath was doing. Most definitely what the Pharisee was doing. So it's ostentatious, seeking attention. What about pretentious? You're attempting to impress somebody. So that's the kind of boasting that we're talking about. It's ostentatious. It's trying to seek attention. Trying to impress somebody. You're pretentious. And that's what we need to be mindful of. All right, the sin of being a boaster. Any questions or comments? Define the sin of inventing evil things. To develop new ways of sinning. That's kind of using that old, take the question and reword it and make it the answer. I'm not sure if that's... Develop new ways of sinning. We'll talk about this for the next few minutes. Sinning is evil doing. Epheuretis, the Greek word, to develop new ways of sinning, a contriver to plan and discover. You'll find that word. You're a contriver, a discoverer, someone that plans or comes up with new ways to do something. Someone that is a discoverer of a different way to participate in sinful acts. I always heard that. There's no new way to sin. This says that there is. Is that a contradiction? I don't think it is. When we talk about this, I think we'll understand a little bit. A discoverer of a different way to participate in sinful activities. People sin. When I think about it, a new way to sin would have to be something technology related that they didn't have 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 2,000 years ago. That's a different way to participate in that, but it's still the same sin. Okay? But I think really what we want to get down to is what we have here near the bottom. After a certain period of time, sinning to the amount or to the level or the same sin that you would do is not as exciting to some people. I put down there, instead of excitement, I said thrill. The thrill of sinning. Some people, that's important, probably not the right word, but to some people it's a necessary thing to keep them feeling alive. They need that excitement. They need that thrill. So if you understand that, after a certain period of time, the thrill is gone. So how do they get that thrill back, that pleasure? Okay? And that way they have to invent a new way to do whatever it is that they were doing. More, increase it. Participate at more frequent activities that cause that same amount or increase the level of excitement or thrill. They do that for the cheap reward. I think we can all agree on that. And what do I mean, the cheap reward? That pleasure that they get, that thrill that they are experiencing, how long is that going to last? I wrote down here, Hebrews 11:25. Hebrews 11:25. Somebody that's handy there, read that. What does it tell us about sin and the pleasures of sin?
Choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin.
Okay, it's talking about Moses there, right? I believe that's right. Moses chose to follow God, to do what God said, to lead the children of Israel out instead of remaining and enjoying those rights and privileges that he would have had as an Egyptian. So long term, he benefited, didn't he? Because he didn't succumb to that short term or that short term thinking of the pleasures of sin. We call it for a season, or they're very short lived. All right. So developing new ways of sinning, finding that new way to experience the thrill or the pleasure that comes from sinning. But we know that that's short-sighted. That's very short-sighted. All right, that's number 78. Number 79. Unless anybody had something. Feel free to speak up. I'm going through these. I'm sensing as we're going through these that we need to keep it moving. If we spend too much time on one, it gets a little, I don't know, stuck in the mud. We may have a lot of mud next couple days. Define the sin of disobedience to parents. This is one that pretty well speaks for itself. What more can you say about it? To not obey your parents. Don't follow the rules. Refusing to obey. Let's look at the word here. Apathase. Not obeying parents, refusing to obey. Then I wrote down the scriptures here. Ephesians 6. Children, obey your parents. Pretty much the same thing in Colossians 3. It was so important that it was included in Exodus 20:12. What is that? The giving of the Ten Commandments. Honor thy father and mother. Isn't that the same thing? Obey your parents. Honor thy father and mother. New Testament, it tells us to obey your parents. And then Deuteronomy 21:18 through 21. It's just one place, but it tells what happens to disobedient children. They weren't going to be long for living by the old law, were they? If you were disobedient, one thing you could be done is taken out of the camp and stoned. Okay? All right. Disobedient to parents, refusing, not obeying your parents, being disrespectful. God tells us we're to honor and obey them. All right. The next word in Romans 1:30 says without understanding. For some reason, this series didn't list this one. Okay? If you're reading from a New King James Version, it says undiscerning. English Standard Version says foolish. Maybe that's one of those things that everybody understood and knew what they were talking about. Without understanding would be the next one in the list in Romans. But our next one is the sin of covenant breaking. The sin of covenant breaking. Failure to keep one's word. What is a covenant? Contract, an agreement. Okay? Even a testament. An agreement between parties. Contract. Okay? In the context of where we're at today, that's the covenant that we're going to talk about, isn't it? Covenant between God and man. And there's always been covenants since the Garden of Eden. What was that covenant? I'll provide everything for you, but you can't do this one thing. Keep and dress the garden. I'll provide for you. Obey me. That was God's side. What was man's side? Give worship, give honor, give respect to God, and don't eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We don't know how long that lasted, but on the pages of the Word, it didn't last very long, did it? Just a few short verses from this is what I expect to this is what they did, which was not according to that. So there's covenants, always been covenants. The covenant between the Jewish nation, you can read about that throughout the book of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, particularly Leviticus 26. I went back and looked at that. That is a list of things that God said, if you do this as a nation, then this is going to be we call it repercussions. This is what I'm going to do for you. And if you go through and look at that, and then you went to Samuel and 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st, 2nd Kings, 1st, 2nd Chronicles, all the rest of the books of the Old Testament, it's almost uncanny that you can find an example of them doing exactly what God said, if you do this, then I'm going to punish you for it. So Leviticus 26, you can look that up, 14 through 39 is what I've got written down, but really it's mostly the whole chapter. Failure to keep one's word. Asunthetos. Failure to keep one's word. The New King James uses the word untrustworthy. Untrustworthy. We mentioned those. The Jewish nation, Jeremiah 31. Jeremiah 39 talks about breaking the covenant. The covenant's going to be over with, and there's going to be a new covenant. I mentioned the word testament. But there's going to be a new covenant foreshadowing or foretelling of Christ coming and establishing of the church. Jeremiah 31 and 34, and other places as well. The marriage covenant, an agreement between people, but also between God, isn't it? What God has joined together, let no man put asunder, Matthew 19. I wrote down some other words that I could find that were associative to this Greek word. Dishonest, fraudulent, void of integrity. Do you want to deal with someone that's void of integrity? That's the last person you want to deal with, isn't it? Can't trust them. Don't know what to do. All right. Define the sin of unnatural affection. Lack of natural love toward your kindred. Kindred being family. I would even say in our society, friends, close associates. Astorgos. Lack of natural love toward your kindred. Hard-hearted toward family. Hard-hearted toward family. How does the Bible say we're supposed to treat family? Yep. Right. 1 Timothy chapter 5. They were told to provide for their households. If you didn't provide for your households, you were worse than what? Worse than an infidel. So we're supposed to provide for our family. How do we do that? This unnatural affection is also termed hard-hearted, but in the New King James it's unloving. Is that right? Someone looking at that? Unloving. Wrote down a couple of examples there. Joseph's brothers, did they have natural affection for their brother? What should have been their... They were all older. They should have been taking care of him, protecting him, watching out for him. What did they do? Grabbed him, threw him in the pit. They were going to kill him, weren't they? Yeah, Reuben prevented that. They were going to kill him, but instead of killing him, Reuben stopped them, and they just sold him into slavery, didn't they? That's not natural affection, is it? Now, as we've studied in the past, Joseph's actions may have had a little bit of that spur that on just a little bit. But still, they should have been providing and protecting him. Mark chapter 7, and I'm not sure whether I've heard this recently, and I don't know whether it was something that we talked about in here or was another class. But there were Jews that were using the excuse of, I'm having to take care of my parents. No, that's not right. Jews that were using the excuse for not taking care of their parents, okay, when dealing with their money situation. Okay? So there were Jews who were not providing for their parents. Well, I have to give, I'm required to give my tithing. Okay? I can't take care of my parents. What does Jesus tell them? Yeah, the first example of giving or providing is to be to your parents or to your family. Okay? And there shouldn't be a choice being made between that. Yes, honor God. Give to God what's respectable to God. But don't use your religious... You understand when I'm using that term? You're being religious to not fulfill your obligation to take care of your family. I think that's what Mark chapter 7 is talking about there. Do we have any examples of the opposite of unnatural affection or natural affection? The one that came to my mind was Jesus on the cross. If the rest of these are unnatural affection, Jesus' words, Jesus' thoughts, Jesus' actions while He was on the cross, shortly before He died, in reference to His mother, would be an example of natural affection, isn't it? He knew He was going to die, shortly going to die. And He looked down, He saw His mother, and what did He do? Right. Told John to take care of her. His thoughts in this dire moment, and don't... Yes, He was God, but He was human too, wasn't He? The pain, the suffering, the anguish, all those things were there on the cross. And where was His thoughts? Taking care of His mother. Told John, she's now yours to take care of. I put lesson sheet number 10 out there. So be sure to get that for next week. I was hoping to get a little further. I know we finished up today's sheet. But there are 3 on lesson 10 that come from Romans as well. We didn't quite get that far today. So, any questions or comments on any of the ways of sinning that Paul mentions here in Romans? John. Right. Yeah. Looking at some of the things that we've got coming up, this will be a simple statement that maybe we can explain later. Attitude, and our attitude has a lot to do with how successful we're going to be in obeying God. Does that make sense? And it may be our attitude is 100% the reason that we are going to be successful in obeying God. And we'll talk about that as we go through. I was noticing that. And everybody understands what attitude is. You can appear to do the right thing like the Pharisees were doing, but because of their attitude or whatever they had in their heart, it was in vain. Isn't that what we talk about? Worshiping in vain. It's worthless. It's empty. You're doing it. There may be benefits to somebody else that you're doing it, but for your benefit, for what you're doing for God, it's worthless simply because of your attitude. Any more questions or comments? We'll take a short break. We'll be back for a worship period.